we've been seeing, once again, the calls that, oh, we're going to have a debt problem and the deficit is blowing up. How should we be thinking about things instead?
Well, I mean, when I think about, what people are referring to as the fiscal stimulus and the potential impact of the deficit getting larger, my first reaction is to say, can the economy take it?
Right.
Can the economy absorb the kind of additional demand that we might see if the tax cuts really do what, the Republicans tell us they're going to do, which is create lots of new demand and spending and employment. And if this, back-ending it with $300 billion in additional new spending and maybe some infrastructure thrown in for good measure, I kind of look at this and go, do we have an economy that can absorb that kind of additional stimulus at this time? Or are we so close to full employment that we're going to run into an inflation problem?
What's your assessment of that question?
That's the big question that economists are wrestling with. And there's not, by any stretch of the imagination, agreement across the economic lines on this question. Most people, I think, at this point would say that they look at this economy and they think that this is an economy that's more or less at full employment. I tend to think that as long as we're seeing people continue to come in from out of the labor force, as long as you believe that firms might respond to the pickup in demand by doing what they haven't been doing really over the course of the recovery, which is, robustly beginning to invest in investment again. And so if we begin to see those kinds of things in pickup in investment spending, then you can create the capacity as demand picks up, and you would expect to avoid a nasty inflationary episode.
But the key gist is that as we try to assess these new fiscal changes, whether the tax cuts or the budget, we should be focusing on the productive capacity of the economy, whether it can take it, and not on the financial aspect about what the deficit and the financing of all that.
Yeah, that's how I always look at it. I'm always interested in the real resource capacity of the nation to absorb the additional spending, whether it's coming from government or whether it's coming indirectly through the private sector as a result of the tax cuts. It's all about the real resource constraints.
Intuitively, most people still look at, they're like, oh, we're adding another $1 trillion to the national debt. You've written a lot about why those concerns are misguided, but how would you sort of briefly describe to people who, for obvious reasons, that sounds like a scary number, are missing the point?
So I look at it, so I'll do this sometimes with audiences, and I like to put some numbers to it because I think it helps to give an example. So people, you're right, they hear deficit and they see it maybe a number that gets reported in a newspaper, or they hear a journalist say the budget deficit is, and they hear a big number, right? And they know there's a negative sign in front of it. They say, this is obviously a very bad thing. So, well, what do we mean when we talk about the budget deficit? So we're talking about the government spending more money into the economy than it taxes back out. So if we put numbers to it, we might imagine the government spending $100 billion into the economy and only taxing $90 billion back out. Now, somewhere we record that the government has run a budget deficit. That gets written down on the government ledger, but we sort of forget the fact that what the deficit did was make a deposit somewhere in the economy of $10 billion. And so the government's red ink, if you like, is the black ink of somebody somewhere else in the economy.
What about the money that leaks out via the trade deficit?
Yeah, so that just creates additional space for government to spend into the economy. Those leakages actually, if you like, create a little bit of a cushion to allow the government's deficit to be larger without creating any inflationary pressure.
Now, obviously, if we say, okay, the government is going to do an extra $1 trillion of stimulus or whatever it is, there's a wide variety of fiscal mix that could be. So it could be tax cuts for the rich, or it could be building lots of new infrastructure. Taken in whole, the Trump fiscal policies, how do they align or differ from what your preferred fiscal policy mix would be?
So if I were designing the tax cuts, I wouldn't have skewed them so that the vast majority of the benefits go to the people who are least likely to spend the windfall back into the economy. If the goal is really to create jobs and stimulate economic activity, then it seems to me you would want to direct the resources, the benefits of the tax cuts, to those who would turn around and spend that money into the economy. So I would have structured the tax cuts. I would have skewed them differently. The people at the very top don't need additional help, but millions of Americans do.
Real quickly, you were an advisor to the Sanders campaign. You were on the Democrats, for the Democrats on the Budget Committee. If the Democrats were presented with the chance to make the individual side of the tax cuts permanent, what would you advise them to do?
Do so selectively.